Hi, good afternoon, it's Dr. Michael McNeil here. We're getting to the time of year where it's so changeable. When it's heavy rain, then it's beautiful, glorious sunshine, and now it looks like the rain's sweeping in again. What I wanted to talk about today was, I think this is going to be quite a multi-part series because there's a lot to this, but I want to get into what a transcendental argument is. And there's a lot of background to fill in. That's like, in a sense, my book really is really laying the groundwork for a transcendental argument, really, regarding the necessity for the existence of God as a prerequisite for coherence, really, for intellectual coherence. And so, which is a big argument to make. It's a tough argument to make, which is why it was a PhD, really. But there's an enormous amount of background to that, and I think it's very, very useful to consider in general terms the sort of like the concept of proof as we move into this as a series. Because my last series I was talking about just analytical philosophy generally, just the analytic tradition, and I'm very much part of the analytic tradition, which means that to make a transcendental argument as an analyst rather than to make a transcendental argument as somebody who's centered and focused in continental philosophy means that there's quite a big tension between that, because the people who tended to have been strong transcendental arguments have been people who come from the continental side. So that's going to be an interesting exploration as to what is it that how can an analyst use transcendental arguments. So what I wanted to talk about today was the concept of proof. Because when we think about how in normal language or evidence proving things, and and to actually understand, there's actually probably 3 or 4 different sorts of or different types of proof, which are associated with different philosophical schools and what they actually mean by proof. That's the interesting thing. That's something we'll come back to again and again, and it's also something which I think is extremely important for people who want to study philosophy and to actually understand philosophy, to actually understand that when we talk about evidence, when we talk about facts, when we talk about proofs, what is actually meant by those terms. They're not like universally abstract terms. They actually exist and have meaning within the language game that you're actually using. I'm not using that term game trivially here. I'm sort of like using it much as Wittgenstein would use that term, and Wittgensteinians who followed after use that term language. A game is just is the reason why he used game was because there's rules for a game, and sometimes those rules, in order to play that game, you have to follow the rules or you're excluded from the game. So we can talk generally about language games of science, or language games of sociology, or language games of psychology, or language games of art. Of what when you're talking about art, or when you're talking about poetry, or when you're talking about what, you will often have your own localized vocabulary, which if somebody's not familiar with the way you might be using the same signs, your words might be the same, but what's actually meant by those words and those signs is different, and that's a real major issue in the philosophy of language. And Wittgenstein in his later period, in his middle and later period, really picked up on that and developed that concept of the language game. And he said that he emphasised in his early years too much of as if the language game of science was normative for all other language games. And so it's really important, sort of like in philosophy, to understand the meaning of the terms which you're actually using, because a lot of the confusions and the errors which have turned up in philosophy have turned up because people have heard a term, or I mean, this is something, you know, this is a general criticism of all philosophers. All of us will be guilty to a greater or lesser degree of this type of what I think I've called it before, a bit of incoherence in our thinking. That if we actually think through, sometimes we won't realise when we're discussing an issue, and then we move on to another issue. We've said this is what we believe, but then later on, if you analyse, which is one of the reasons why analysis is so useful, when you analyse what I've just said, you suddenly realise, well, didn't you just say before that this is what you are basing it on? And that's why, in a sense, you have peer review people, and people who understand what you're talking about, and they say, well, actually, and then they come and say, well, if you actually really believe what you said you believe there, you can't say this. And so that's just the idea of, in a sense, of constructive criticism work. So this concept of proof. Now, the first sort of form of proof, which is perhaps the most radical form of proof, or the strongest form of proof, and that's what you would call a logical proof, or rational with a capital R, a rational proof. Because if you can remember, we were trying to make the general distinction between rational with a small r, which is just somebody who's trying to use their intellectual faculties and talk about the world, and but there was a school of rationalists. They were called Transcendental rationalists, who, like Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, they're the three great rationalists, and they had a particular concept of proof, and their concept of proof is a very strong concept of proof. It's a logical proof, and this in a sense is what you might say proof is deductive, which will go through all the way through back to Aristotle in particular. So a logical proof, if your premises are correct, then your conclusion follows inevitably from your premises, so your conclusion will be correct. That means that if at a later point one of those premises is shown to be false, then that invalidates your conclusion. So that's, if you like, the general taxonomy, which just basically means the structure of a logical proof. So a classical logical proof, probably the ones is that all men are mortal. It's like one of your premises. Socrates is a man. That's your second premise. And therefore, which is your conclusion, therefore Socrates is mortal. So you see that's inevitable. If those two premises are correct, your conclusion is certain. And so that's the great attraction of that form of proof, that the conclusions follow from the premises. And so one of the foundational principles of the rationalist school was that proof should be rational. Which makes sense. In a sense, proof should be rational, logical. So it should be, and what you do is you take those simple premises, you combine them into other arguments, and out pops a rational proof at the end. So something very simple, like that very simple, self-evident form of argument there, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, the idea was you would find lots of other simple arguments of that form, combine them together into arguments which are not self-evidential. You can just look at that and you can see that it's true, but you combine those simple ones together to form complicated arguments, and those conclusions that flow out of those simple propositions are combined into this big argument, which are not self-evidential. They would provide you with logical and certain proofs about the world. And so you see this especially in Spinoza and Leibniz, and with Descartes, obviously, because Descartes was of that thought, but you find that their systems are very, very elaborate. They are coherent in the sense they are internally consistent, but the criticism that has always been that Descartes was a dualist. He separated between what he considered a reality or substance that is extended in space. So that's, if you like, your physical, your body, and between the mental, which he believed wasn't extended in space. So he split reality between the body and the mind, which the mind he considered to be non-corporeal, non-physical, not extended in space, which is another way of saying that it's not, it's not made of what we would call matter. Now, Spinoza was a monist, and which basically means he believed that the physical and the mental are all the same stuff. There was just one stuff, starting from the same premise as Descartes, but came to a different conclusion. Now, the third great rationalist, Leibniz, he concluded that there was an infinite plurality of stuffs. He called them monads, monadology. So, without going into the details of monadology, which is one of those fascinating concepts which bears what word am I looking for here? It bears an unusual similarity to modern physics and its concept of energy, and which is sort of like remarkable, because he believed in, like, say, he was like an atomist, a logical atomist, believed in that reality was made up of distinct, non-related entities called monads, and that the great orchestrating monad he called God. And he was attempting to be, in his philosophy, which is another fascinating aspect of his work, as he was actually attempting to defend what he considered to be Orthodox Christianity. He wanted to defend a Christian view of the world, and he is also famous for his theodicy, which is like the theodicy is defending the ways of God. It's often considered a defense against the argument from evil, which we looked at in a previous video. So it's the three great rationalists, Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, all had radically different views of the world. Descartes, on the face of it at least, Descartes was a dualist, Spinoza was a monist, and Leibniz was an atomist. And so now I did have a discussion with one of the examiners of my thesis. When he wrote a response, I went into a bit of correspondence with him about this particular issue, and he actually said that there was more similarity between the views of Spinoza and Leibniz than you might appear on the surface, because Spinoza had been censored by just about everybody. He was a Jew. He was actually a Dutch Jew based in Amsterdam, and he'd been censored by the Jewish authorities. He then got censored by the Catholics and the Protestants. So he really got censored. By Dr. Professor Almata, when he was giving me this feedback on the thesis, he made the point that Leibniz, although he didn't agree with Spinoza's monism, there was still quite a lot of similarity between their views. But I think the criticism, nevertheless, if you're not wanting to drill down into the intricacies of the rationalist view, I think you've still got that very stark problem with rationalism attempting to generate a worldview from the basic rational principle. So you're trying to combine these simple logical blocks together, which then generate something that's non-self-evident. So you're trying to get from the simple propositions are self-evident, the complicated webs of them are non-self-evident, but they're supposed to be this logical necessity. So it's a bit like Descartes was very much he was a great mathematical innovator as well. He came up with a new notation many rationalists have been attracted to mathematics, if you like, knowledge modelled after mathematics, and that's not just a lot. I think a lot of that's an interesting, that idea of knowledge being modelling after mathematics appears and reappears in different philosophical schools, but it was very attractive to the rationalists because they were trying to say that this flows inevitably. But you then got the problem of the great rationalists, which is one of the reasons why rationalism, I wouldn't say it's in disrepute necessarily in modern philosophy, but it's certainly considered faulty. It's certainly considered almost, somebody would say, wounded beyond recovery, because it's got this basic problem of those who were alleging perfect rationalism and perfect deductions ended up with philosophies which were very different and worldviews which were very different and contradictory with one another. If you consider monism to be, the exact opposite of logical atomism and dualism, again, to have they're very difficult to reconcile. They're all supposed to be rationalist, moving from perfect premises that are modelled after mathematics, with a logical necessity. For them to end with such diverse views would be considered self-contradictory. There's something wrong with it. But the idea of a logical proof, that's still, you still have to accept the importance of and the power of a logical proof. So that's why when people are learning philosophy, they do learn about logic, and the interesting thing is you then find as well that there are logics. So there's not just one form of logic. There's not just Aristotle's logic and syllogistic logic. Aristotle's, syllogism was his most extensive contribution to logic, but also in Aristotle, that's the interesting thing, also in Aristotle actually used a transcendental argument to argue for logic, because he says that you can't argue about logic without using the concept of logic. So we'll just push that to the side. That's like a little preview because that's a very important, we will try and describe what's distinctive about a transcendental form of argument, but that's like, if you like, a little preview. But it's interesting to think that in Aristotle, who's most famous for his syllogistic style of logic of all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, that's what's called a logical syllogism. And that syllogistic form of logic, you don't necessarily even need, it doesn't mean you're always going to have more than one premise, because it doesn't, otherwise you end up with logical fallacies if you've just got a single premise and you're saying that the conclusion follows from that single premise. That's almost like might be called that's just called affirming the consequent or something. Obviously you're not deducing anything if you've just got a single premise. You're almost just like you're almost generating a premise, and you do find that fallacy in that appears when people are criticising particular arguments. Some people, you find it quite a lot, I think, in evolutionary style arguments where evolution is assumed in the premise before, rather than as a conclusion from it. It's almost like it's like a tautology. It's sort of implying itself, and so the most useful forms of syllogisms are when you've got more than one premise. Otherwise, you have to be very sharp with your. Logic isn't something I've studied in detail. I'm sure a logician, even at my level of understanding of logic, when you've just got a single premise, it's very easy to be fallacious in your logic, no matter what you're doing. So you're always going to want to, when you're working with syllogisms, you're normally going to want more than one premise, because that's what you're trying to group premises together anyway to say, well, this follows from your premises. So that's, if you like, the first type of proof, which is like a rational proof. Now the second type of proof we could say is what would be, I think a good way of describing it is like empirical proof. So where you're using empirical methods. So it's like if you wanted to ask the question, is it raining outside? And it's like, so is it raining outside? Yep, it is. How do I know? Because I look up and I can see the rain on the glass and I can hear it. And so it's like an empirical proof is because it's like, if this is interesting when we think about rational, where the difference between a rational proof and an empirical proof, because a rational proof has a logical certainty about it. But it's like if we were trying to come up with a syllogistic argument to answer the question, is it raining? We could have a big problem, because you might think, you would, even if you think about what's the barometric pressure, what's the wind, what's the temperature, what time of year it is, they might all be factors which would enter into, which you might try and generate and use your premise and say, if the barometric pressure is underneath 999 millibars and if the wind speed is above such and such, and you might then be able to say, and is the air pressure such and, in fact barometric pressure is air pressure, isn't it? But whatever factors we want to come up to try and say, is it raining? What time of year is it? What temperature is it outside? Even if we have all those particular bits of information that we want to try and stick into our logical argument to try and decide whether it's raining, we would never be able to say by logical necessity that it is raining. We'd only be able to get so far. So the argument's not, is what we might call, it's like there's a fallible element. It's a fallible argument. You can't generate a syllogism to answer that question, and so that's one of the really interesting points that we should notice, that some questions cannot be answered by logical argument, and that is in fact a very important philosophical principle to actually understand, is actually to realise actually some arguments cannot be decomposed into logical parts to give us a absolute answer. They're always going to give us a degree of probability, whereas for an empirical argument, that's the interesting thing with an empirical argument, if you like, an empiricist proof, is you're actually confirming something. Your empirical argument is to do with the five senses. And so is it touch, taste, feeling, what are five senses? Vision, vision, hearing, touch, taste. But I'm sure, I know we have five senses, because when people talk about sixth sense of their intuition. But you're talking about something that can be measured, touched, and so that, if you like, is your empirical argument, or your empirical proof is going to be based upon taking data from the physical environment and then coming up with a argument that strongly suggests that conclusion, or answers the question, like, is it raining? Well, I'm looking, and I will use my observation. Where it becomes more difficult is, say, is it raining a couple of miles away? And so you would have to then take other empirical data, look at the data. If you haven't got a telescope or something, or even if you can see like a sheet of what looks like rain going across the sky, you have to understand that with empirical arguments, there is always a degree of fallibility to them, and so they are, you might say, that's a weaker form of proof, because there's fallibility with it. But the interesting thing about, say, like empirical arguments is that this is one of the reasons why Descartes rejected, if you like, empirical arguments, because he says that your senses were fallible, and he says if your senses are fallible in this instance, you can't rely on them for reliable you can't rely on your senses. And so that's why he rejected like sense data as the basics. He said if you want to be certain, you have to use deduction. And so that would be a criticism of that view, is that how do you normally correct empirical observations which are false? So say I looked at something and I thought it meant that, you would make further empirical observations and that corrected your previous empirical observations. So, and that in many ways is what is assumed. Empirical proofs are very, very important, say, in scientific investigations and reinvestigations and reassessing your data. That's what you do so much of that when you're working, if you've ever done data analysis or research. And when you've a great example in, say, physics, which I know something about, is say Newtonian physics. You've got the great Newton's great sort of, he called it his universal gravitational equation, and it predicted, you can use Newtonian physics to predict the orbits of the planet around the sun, and you can do it with quite a commendable degree of accuracy. And when Einstein was, in a sense, revolutionising the understanding of physics in the early 20th century, he predicted that because of quantum effects, because Newton's assumption was that light was a wave, electromagnetic waves, and Einstein showed it was one of his earliest papers, I think. He showed that the light had packets, when there was packets of energy called photons, and he said that because these were like localized packets, they would be subject to a gravitational field, and they would be bent by a gravitational field, even though these are just like packets of energy, photons. He said that, and he predicted that there was an eclipse of Jupiter that was due, and he said that if you use if you used Newton's equations, because it was assuming light was a perfect wave, it wouldn't be affected by gravity, and the eclipse would be at this time. If you factor in with Einstein's with his equations, he was saying that because it's not these have got mass, these photons have got mass, and therefore they're going to be affected by a gravitational field, even though the mass of the photon is absolutely tiny. But it still has some mass, and therefore it's going to be influenced by a gravitational field. And he said because of that, the light is going to be bent by a gravitational field, by the eclipse, and the eclipse will be delayed by, I think it was something like maybe 20 minutes, because of the vast distance between ourselves and Jupiter. And so this was like a argument that was generated from empirical premises, and if it was true, then we can test this. This is like a hypothesis. You can test this as something fundamental in natural science. And so because nobody really considered that on the basis of the data, on the basis of previous observations. They'd never considered that was a possibility. And so a part of the process of, say, of empirical analysis or empirical investigation is where you might revisit your data to look at things you'd ignored because theories moved on. Somebody's come up with some other sort of theory which may be mathematical, maybe deductive, and you're then looking at what are going to be the implications of that new theory. And he said, well, we've got all this data. Maybe if we re-look at this data, we might see some of those effects. And that's exactly what happened with quantum mechanics. Right, welcome back to part 2. Somebody just rang on the doorbell there, delivering stove cleaner. So the takeaway I want to get from, just to summarise the point I was just getting to, is that with empirical proofs are, proofs that result from the use of your senses, and they're very, very common in science. So the point I was making there with Einstein is when Einstein came back with his quantum theory, he demonstrated, and it could be empirically verified, that light was bent because of the mass of the photons, and it delayed the eclipse by I think it might have been something like 20 minutes from the time on Earth, which is something that couldn't be explained on the basis of Newton's equation, because it was assuming that light was a wave and it would travel in straight lines. It wouldn't be bent by the if you understand anything about Newtonian space, there isn't any sort of bending, or unless you're moving through a uniform medium, the light would be going in a straight line, and that was so. Previous empirical observations are corrected by new empirical observations, and that's something to understand about empirical proofs, is that they are the more data you have to support your empirical argument, the stronger that proof will be. But it can never get to the place of, say, a logical proof of logical necessity, which is one of the reasons why there, in some fields, there was a preference for or a bias towards, say, logical proofs modelled after pure mathematics. But as we can see, some questions are not readily amenable to being answered with rational proofs. So the question, like now, it's really raining again. You might even hear it in the background. That's not amenable to being argued by a rational argument. It's only really an empirical process is going to help you to answer that question. It might not. The disadvantage of an empirical argument is unless you've got direct access to, say, I can look now and say it's raining. It's unless you've got direct access, there's always going to be some sort of fallibility in your argument. So that's interesting. Now, you might want another form of argument is maybe what you would call abductive argument, and an abductive argument sounds like a a deductive argument, but it's only resulting in and it sort of sounds, if you like an because when we talk about, say, empirical arguments, what we would more normally, the word that might better describe them, sorry, I'll correct myself here, the word that I might better describe a normal empirical argument is, say, an inductive argument. And an inductive argument is where you move from particular instances to your observations, and you then come up with, say, a general rule. And so when people say, so induction is very, very important in science, in the scientific method, because you're sort of investigating, you're recording, your then hypothesis said, in these particular set of circumstances, if my hypothesis is correct, I should see these results. And so you're using particular, you're saying, right, if I change this particular variable, if my hypothesis is correct, I'm going to see this result. And so your individual empirical observations then allow you to come up with what you would call an inductive generalization. And so but there's always a degree of fallibility in your inductions. There's nothing logically necessary about your inductions, which is what I fondly call the Christmas turkey problem, which I think I've already discussed in a previous video. But an abductive argument is an argument where you're trying to come to so it can sound like a deductive argument, or it can sound like an inductive argument, but it's to the best. It's I think the formal term is to the most probable outcome. So you're accepting that you're never going to be able to firm up your premises. Enough for it to be like a deductive argument, but it might be a bit stronger than, say, an induction. It's not based on some sort of observation of in the physical world, and so your conclusion, abductive reasoning, is really, it's, sometimes people might say, oh, you're doing the best you can with the information you've got, and then you're basing your action on what you decide to do. You're basing it on your best possible outcome, your best possible understanding of the different variables at the time. So but it can sound like an inductive argument, or it can sound like a deductive argument, but you haven't got the degree of certainty, and so it's still people do reason and do use abduction the best possible. You're trying to proceed on the best possible basis of your data. Now, the next form of argument that might be useful to consider is what you would call, say, or a concept of proof, and that would be useful because is what you would call, say, pragmatic proof. Because a pragmatism is very, very much associated with, there was somebody in the 19th century called Peirce, and he came up with the pragmatic, what would be called the pragmatic, what's it called, the pragmatic principle. The pragmatic axiom is that you should judge the effect. Sorry, you should judge the utility of an action on its effect, and so you might not understand it theoretically, but if it's useful to you after the fact of when something's happened, if it's useful to you, then you then accept that that's true for you. So it's implicit in that is a much weaker sort of, like, it's not a logical truth. It's not a strong logical theory of truth. It's basically saying that if something works for you, that's why people, even in normal language, people say, I'm taking the pragmatic approach. and that just means that I haven't got any firm commitments. I'm just going to do that which seems to be expedient at the time and is of the most personal benefit to myself. So politicians are notoriously known for being pragmatic. You know, when somebody says, oh, they're principled, that might be the equivalent of, say, I'm using logic and deduction, strong. I've got some sort of strong ideological commitments, whereas a pragmatist would be somebody who, what can give me the most useful or best result in this situation. I'm not particularly bothered about what my principles might be. I just want to get the maximum benefit in a particular situation, and that's what you. So that's the basic pragmatic. If you do pragmatic approach, so the pragmatic principles, you look at, say, it's the consequences of an action that help you decide, is that helping me manage my environment in some way and helping me to solve these individual problems of my environment. If that's the case, then I'm going to accept that as a truth. I'm not going to even argue about whether this is logically true or definite proof. It's just, is it instrumentally useful? Can I do something with this? And pragmatism is very much, that sort of pragmatic form of proof is very much associated with, it's very much an American view. It's very strong. Some great, and industrialists tended to be very, very pragmatic as well in their approach. They weren't necessarily interested in trying to work out or trying to demonstrate the necessity for something. They were just saying that if I do this, then we can solve this problem. So it's a very people like John Dewey was famous for being an instrumentalist. So William James was another pragmatist, and they're known for emphasising the effect of an action in judging it, rather than arguing about whether something is theoretically true or false. And in fact, Dewey said, there's no answer to, say, human scepticism. We can't justify reason rationally, but if we do this particular process, then we can manage our environment and it's beneficial for us, and therefore let's do it. So that's the classic sort of like pragmatic notion of proof. And you can see again, it's much weaker. It's not even pretending. They're even saying that it's going one step beyond, say, induction. It's actually saying it doesn't even matter whether this is true or false in some other ways. What matters is this actually useful to us? If so, then yes. So you can see it's a much weaker form of argument, or if you're trying to, say, provide a pragmatic proof, it's really saying, well, is this useful to me? Then yes. So then fine, I'll do it. Now, so you can see there's a degree of what you might call fallibilism, what's called fallibilism, yeah. So fallible, being that there's not necessarily certainty there. But the other form of proof, which is the core of what I'm sort of arguing in my work, but it's based on what you might call transcendental proof. Now, what makes transcendental proof distinctive from, say, a deductive proof or an inductive proof, an empirical proof, a pragmatic proof? What makes a transcendental proofs unique is that they're not arguing, they're not trying to provide a justification for an individual argument in nature. To say I'm trying to think of a relatively simple sort of example. If you were sort of like saying, is there a growing tree in the desert or something? So you say you had that question you wanted to answer. a transcendental question would be very much more considering what do you mean by a tree? What do you mean by growing? And that would help you to actually understand what it means to provide a proof for what is there a growing tree in the desert. So you're trying, the idea of a transcendental sort of like proof is that you're trying to provide the grounds for what are sufficient grounds for even trying to assert that you can have an inductive proof or a deductive proof or an empirical proof. What are you already assuming about the relations of nature that allow you to even generate those proofs? And so you're operating at a level above those other proofs. I hope you can see that, because that's like a key distinctive. So you're not arguing about, say, some individual fact of nature, or trying to answer individual questions. You're rather trying to say, what am I assuming in my worldview that allows me to even ask the question in the first place? So, and this is one of the most radical understandings of radical challenges that it has become. What am I trying to say here? It's really sort of like digging into. It's why I called my work epistemological self-consciousness. It's that self-conscious aspect of actually understanding the presuppositions of your theory of the world, or if you like, your theory of nature. It's a term that Quine used a lot as well. He would say that your theory of nature is defining your theory of the world. So he was saying you can't, or any individual fact of nature, even your concept of what a fact is going to depend on your theory of nature. And so there are no sort of things like just brute abstract facts. They're always, that word fact or that signed fact is always indexed to a particular view or a particular theory of nature. And so this is, again, you can sort of like, you can think about the contribution of Wittgenstein again there, where we're saying this is like a language game. So if you like, your view of nature is like a language game, and it's something that people became very, very aware of in the latter half of the 20th century with, say, the collapse of the logical positivist view. We looked at verificationism and how Quine in his two dogmas of empiricism sort of like really pulled it to pieces and actually said, and so, but what had to flow out of that, Quine wasn't interested in some sort of in some sort of religious view, or he was very much still a naturalist and wanted to, in a sense, he really psychologized knowledge in many ways. He said he was naturalizing epistemology and ontology, and so, which is, ontology is just a theory of being, so it's to do with metaphysics. He just preferred, when in his discussions he was talking about ontology rather than using sort of like the term metaphysics. But your concept of nature and your concept of proof and what you're going to do, they're all sort of dependent on each other, and the terms and the very words you're using are assuming a particular philosophy of facts. And so when you're presenting a proof, if you're trying to, unless you understand the principles that allow you to generate that proof at all, you're either going to be ignorant of the limitations to your proof and how strong your proof is, and and that's always going to be a fatal weakness in your worldview. So it's like, unless you actually understand what makes your proof even possible, what makes the empirical, why would we trust empirical judgments? Why would we consider, logic doesn't fit into a materialist view of the universe? Why would I? Why do we consider logic? What legitimizes logic if we can't? Those are very sort of important problems of actually understanding how do we generate what legitimizes our proofs. Whereas a pragmatist is just going to say, I don't care about that. I just find this process useful. I don't really want to know what legitimizes it. And in some ways, pragmatism is considered the running away from these problems, and the pragmatists are doing what's called begging the question, which basically means that they are. If a pragmatist says, I just want to, I'm only going to do those things. Does this process benefit me in some way? Does it allow me to control my environment? If that's the case, I'm going to do it. But the problem is, for the pragmatist, is always, what do you decide are the problems of your environment? How are you deciding that what are your problems, and what things are useful to you? Without realizing it, you've already got a worldview and a framework, conceptual framework that you're using to decide what things are useful to us. What problems do we need to solve in society? That's that was one of Dewey's great emphasis was solving the problems of society, or being a benefit to society. We're scientific because it produces good outcomes, but the problem is, how are you defining what a good outcome is? You're not defining what a good outcome is on a pragmatic basis. You're deciding on some other theoretical your pre-pragmatic criteria that you're using to decide that something is good. And that's one of the reasons why pragmatism is one of the fatal weaknesses of pragmatism, and it's why that although there are in the time of say Dewey and the people that adopted sort of like Dewey's view, the movement itself, that's why in one sense it was quite with Dewey, James and Peirce, you can't look at say philosophy in the 20th century and really say, suddenly there was loads of pragmatists that flowed out. There were some, and there still are some, but there's always that weakness to the view, is that you're always assuming something, and your things that you're considering important, or those things that you're considering beneficial, they're always decided on some non-pragmatic basis. And so there's always that incoherence, in what people would call incoherence in that view. And so that's one of the reasons why it's always pragmatism is always I suppose you would say it's got say a questionable intellectual status, because it's so obviously defective on that point. And but people nevertheless, it's very attractive in the sense is that if you've got a few presuppositions that you're just, however you've come to them, and you've just said, I believe this is good, or this is good this is socially beneficial, we can see this is socially beneficial, it's very, very easy to sort of to jump over that question of why do we consider this beneficial? What is it about this is beneficial? How have we decided that this is beneficial? You're always it's still nevertheless very attractive in particular, say, in political philosophy or in political science, where people have an idea of what would be better or beneficial. Because I think you can see that sort of the challenge of pragmatism. You can see that very much in, say, in post-Second World War. I think this is probably true of the Western world generally, but I know particularly in Britain, what happened with we after the Second World War, we had a major the politics of the nations was radically changed by the Second World War, and people wanted change, and we had the great we had our first socialist, the Labour Party, who are our socialist party. We had the first great socialist administration. Whether or not you want to call it great is another matter. But there was the view that the most important thing, say for example, how do we solve the problem? People not being able to have housing is a real problem. How can we most effectively solve this problem? Well, what's the pragmatic solution to this? We've only got a certain amount of land, we've only got a certain amount of material, we need to do this quick, so what do? Pragmatic solution was put up lots of high-rise tower blocks, which were something new in the UK. You just didn't see, we haven't got it was a combination of sort of history and geography and we haven't got many tall buildings, but suddenly in the big major urban cities, the way to solve this problem of the housing problem is to put up these tower blocks. And so after the Second World War, we had these tower blocks that went up, lots of tower blocks in urban areas. Now the problem was that they became modern slums. So we got rid of slums, we did all this slum clearance, and then suddenly people found because it was just done on a purely pragmatic basis, people just said, what's the problem? Problem is lack of houses. How do we solve the lack of houses? Build tower blocks, make very useful and effective use of space, very efficient, very dense. But the problem was all those factors of density, people not having gardens, of antisocial neighbours that had been built, the materials they were built of, the layout of the estates, all this sort of stuff. So all those factors weren't appreciated as to how important they were, because it was just a pragmatic solution to a problem. And so pragmatism always has that issue, is that it's very, very easy to just say, analyse, find a particular problem, say, right, this is the way we're going to solve that problem, and not consider all the other factors. So a pragmatic proof or a pragmatic argument is always going to be very weak from the point of view of any type of logical rigour or certainty regarding your outcome. So that's something, because pragmatism is something that's very, very pervasive in, particularly in political philosophy in the Western world, which is one of the reasons why we have so much chaos in our political philosophies. In some ways, pragmatism is a response to the theory. Sometimes people get bogged down in their theories, and that's what frustrated, say, Dewey or James, which gave a little bit of the impetus to the pragmatic movement, because we said we want to get something done now. We don't want to wait until we can understand all the factors and all the variables, and then let's just do something now. But we can see the effects of pragmatism if we don't sometimes pause and stop and think about something and actually do some rational thought and some empirical analysis. If we're too rapid in our quest to solve some sort of social problem, we can end up generating more social problems. And perhaps we see that in a sense with some things that are happening been happening in some of the big cities in the US, is that as people have come in and said, well, we want to help people, not be judgmental, with sort of like with it's happened in, say, I think it's happened particularly in, say cities like San Francisco, people have come in and with very liberal views, but the problem is that suddenly now you've got vast amounts of public drug taking and boarded up sort of commercial areas, and it's caused, even though it had like a good, people thought, oh, this is just a pragmatic solution to a pragmatic, non-judgmental solution to a problem. It's actually created a lot of chaos on the back of that. So recapitulating in a sense of sort of like trying to get to we had rational proofs, we had empirical proofs, and empirical proofs are the backbone of what you might call the inductive method of going from specifics to the general, whereas in the sense the deductive is always going from, say, a general principle to the specific. And that's what's interesting about when you use, say, the inductive method. When you're trying to come up, induction in the sense was trying to come up with some sort of general principle, and so that led to some people arguing about, say, well, when we have rules, say laws of physics, are they just inductive generalizations, or are they logical in character, and can we use them in some sort of deductive method? So that's definitely something to that's a subtle aspect of it. That's been one of the big discussions in the philosophy of science, is are, say, things that we call the laws of physics, are they inductive generalizations, and therefore they should be considered fallible, because anything that's non-deductive is going to be fallible to a greater or lesser degree. So that's the key distinction between, say, anything that's not, any other argument that's not non-deductive, there's always going to be some sort of fallibility when it's trying to describe when it's trying to generate a proof. Now, the distinctive form of argument is a transcendental argument. Now, that is an argument that is trying to demonstrate or provide a proof as to what allows you to use, what justifies your use of induction or pragmatic argument, or a abductive argument, or in a sense even justifying logic in itself. It's trying to provide some sort of justification as to why you can use those arguments. So it's almost like it's trying to provide because it's not dealing with the specific aspect of nature, it's dealing with the principle. It's like with a transcendentalist has the advantage that they can then use, say, an inductive argument, or they can then use, or they've legitimized, provided some sort of justification for logic. Because some people argue against logic by just saying, well, logic's just arbitrary, it's just socially defined in some way, we just find it useful, it's axiomatic, we just come with these axioms, they're useful to us, they solve problems, therefore we're going to use them. Whereas the transcendentalist is trying to tie with their metaphysics, is actually saying, no, this is the way reality really is. And so a transcendentalist has the advantage that they can use deductive arguments, they can use inductive arguments, they can even use have pragmatic considerations in there. And so that's all I'm trying to do here is to introduce those terms, those major terms, those major concepts of proof, to help you understand that except for the deductive mode, there's fallibility built in. So there's fallibility built into induction, there's fallibility built into the pragmatic approach, the fallibility is built into that, and with the deductive, on the face of it, it's a much stronger form of argumentation, because you're saying that your conclusion follows from your premises, and unless you invalidate the premises, your conclusion's solid, it's firm. But you then have the problem, which is the problem that of how do you provide some sort of rationale, some sort of justification for logic, because you can't go into nature and say, I found logic in nature. And so the transcendentalist is actually dealing with that problem. They're not just sort of saying, well, we're going to assume that logic. Is that logic useful to us? Which is what a pragmatist would say. But they're trying to provide some sort of justification. So the transcendentalist, in a sense, has got a much bigger epistemological toolbox, because they can coherently use, say, deductive arguments. They can coherently use inductive arguments. They can coherently use pragmatic arguments. They can use those because they've got some sort of justification for why induction, say, is a legitimate principle. Why is deduction a legitimate process? There's some sort of justification there, because one of the big moves in, say, 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, one of the great moves in philosophy was saying, well, actually, no, there is no justification for those things. They're all socially constructed. They're all arbitrary. We just pick and choose. It's relativistic, and in literature, the deconstructionists were saying absolutely there's no reference to any of our language, that it's all totally arbitrary. The death of the author, which is very ironic, because you have to read their work to get to the conclusion to say, there is no resident meaning in my work. But you can see how the transcendental approach is 100% opposed to the deconstructionist approach. It's actually saying, well, let's answer these big, tough questions as to why if we assume, why is logic, what does it say about the universe if logic, what is it saying about reality? Why can we use induction, or why can we use deduction? Why can we ask these questions? And so that is the, what provides, what are we assuming about the world? There's something, there's truth, there's reality, there's some sort of interconnection between why do things behave the way they do. And so the transcendentalist is interested in that question, and is really interested in providing some sort of intellectual coherence to your philosophy. And it's not just, say, intellectual coherence, because Leibniz and Spinoza are known for having a coherent philosophy, but there was no way those philosophies could be tied into the real world. So that's the interesting thing about, say, the second aspect of, say, transcendentalism, is that it wants to know how do we tie this in to the real world, because we looked at verification previously, and we said that was an attempt to tie in and to construct a theory of knowledge and a theory of meaning, and it was trying to tie in to the physical world. But we then found that it was the verification principle itself. There was no justification for the verification principle that provided this tying in. And so the transcendental question is how would you justify a verification principle? Is it possible to justify a verification principle on a transcendental basis? Which is that's an area of research. That's almost where I finished my research, was saying this is a proposed solution to the problem of the verification principle, is that it can be justified on a transcendental basis. And I never actually evaluated to any degree that assertion that the transcendental principle could be justified. Can't be justified on an empirical basis, but can it be justified on a transcendental basis? So when you're asking transcendental questions, you're asking questions about what legitimizes your question? What are you assuming? What you're bringing to it? You know, Kant's famous discussion of the transcendental method was the, you know, what do we have to assume about objects to make the objects of knowledge possible at all? And so that's why he's considered the father of the transcendentalist approach, the critique of pure reason. He was trying, it says, the transcendental deduction of the different categories of the human understanding. And so he was trying to say there was some fundamental things in our psychology and our understanding that we always bring to the world, and we then remake the world according to these categories. That's the most controversial aspect of his, because he was saying that the mind is then constitutive of reality. You know, then the mind is creating the objects of reality, whereas the realist view is always very much the world is out there and we're in contact with the objects of those worlds directly. They're not mediated to us by, you know, we're not cut off from reality by the processes of the mind. So the modern transcendentalists, which is generally considered to be anybody who followed Strawson in 1959 wrote a book on it. He was called District Individuals, I think he called it, and an essay in descriptive metaphysics. And he's generally considered to be, going to get a bit hoarse here. He was what was known as a neo-Kantian. So he was saying that when you consider Kant's psychologism, he considered that to be unsafe, and I think most neo-Kantians that's their starting point. They would not be convinced. They're convinced by Kant's question, and the interesting thing is, in my research, is that Van Til said that Kant was asking the right question, but his use of the psychological apparatus of the categories to provide some sort of transcendental for human knowledge, they would say that's weak and unsafe, because you're assuming that all human beings think in the same way, that all human beings have got this sort of conceptual apparatus that they then bring, and you know that, and most neo-Kantians would reject that sort of psychological aspect, but they are still saying that the question that he was asking, the transcendental nature of, when you analyse, when we, you know, I'll talk about Strawson at some point, Strawson's arguments, you know, in some detail, to try and show that Strawson was interested in the ability of a transcendental mode of argumentation to overcome the problem of skepticism, and he said that when somebody tries to generate, say, a skeptical argument over, say, can I try this? He was saying that one of the assumptions of, say, one of the arguments, it's one of the most famous arguments, I think, in his book, where he was saying, he said, there's no doubt that we all assume that there is a spatial temporal world of objects out there, and that those objects are persisting through time, and that's an elaborate way of saying that we are assuming that, he said, there's no doubt about it in our experience of the world, just in order for us to make sense of reality, and we assume that there's a world that is external to us, and that it's got objects in there, and that those objects persist in time. So imagine you go to bed, because he was saying that, say, a hard-going skeptic might say this, you know, you go to bed at night and you look at the alarm clock, and you know, you turn over and you want to go to sleep. And so a thoroughgoing skeptic might say, how do you know that alarm clock, when you wake up the next day, because you weren't looking at that alarm clock and you're awake all night, how do you know that that alarm clock that is there is the same alarm clock as what that was there when you went to bed? How do you know that somebody has not come in the middle of the night and changed the alarm clock with one that looks just like it, or taken or changed all the furniture in your room? It looks just like the same furniture you had. How can you show that that's not true? And so, on the face of it, you can't. So that's what a skeptic would say. Well, no, you can't. We can't be certain about it because you can't say that that's not a realistic scenario. And so, but what Strawson tries to do, well, what he does is that he says, right, okay, you've got the individual. The transcendental question is not about is that a legitimate scenario that somebody could come in and change my alarm clock, change my furniture? And you can say, yes, you can say yes, that could have possibly happened, but he's saying that's not really the question we're interested in here. He's saying the transcendental question is that can you the transcendental question is the question of whether those objects are persisting through time, external to our perception of them. Okay, because Berkeley, if you studied Bishop Berkeley at all, one of the early empiricists, who was also, unusually for an empiricist, he was also an idealist, and he said that it's only when an object is perceived that it's real. And so he was saying that unless an object is perceived in our perception, they don't really exist, which he was trying to deal with the question of materialism. And so he was saying that the best way to deal with the problem of materialism, because people are attacking Christianity through materialism, was to actually get rid of materialism in its entirety, the material world in its entirety. A very bold, dramatic. But it was interesting because he was an empiricist, but he was an idealist. So he believed that reality, objects, only existed when they were perceived. And so, with Strawson, sort of like in a sense coming back to this question, he was saying that the transcendental question is the persistence of those objects through time when I'm not looking at them, outside, i.e. separate from my perception of them. And so he's actually saying that if you try and argue, and it might be worth sort of like in detail sort of picking through that argument at some point, but he was saying that your attempt it's easy to see the individual case that it's possible, yes, somebody could have swapped my stuff out, but consider the general case. What the transcendental question is that when we go to bed at night, consider the population as a whole. When the population as a whole go to bed at night, and they've got an alarm clock in there and they've got some big furniture, when they wake up in the morning, they, as far as they can tell, all the furniture is the same, their bed is the same, their pajamas are the same, everything's the same. And he was saying that to try and come up with a general argument that says that we cannot conclude that there is persistence of objects without us, outside of our perception of them, that i.e. there's actually a real external physical world of objects out there. He said that in order to try and use and generalize that case of the individual objects, that case of the individual being able to have all their stuff swapped and your alarm clock's not the same alarm clock, he said the problem is you've already assumed the concept of an alarm clock, you've already assumed the concept of furniture, you've already assumed the concept that of a room with particular things in a particular relation to each other. And so he's saying that your skepticism about whether or not anyone can if you're trying to come up with a general skeptical argument of saying because in the individual situation you can't give me a convincing argument that says that that's not the particular alarm clock, that's not your particular piece of furniture, that it's not your particular chair there, because you can't show to me, because you weren't awake all night watching those, that they weren't changed. Because he's saying that even if you are asleep, and you've got no direct perception of that, you are still assuming, when you're trying to come up with that, trying to generalize that particular argument, that particular case of where you have to say yes, you have to admit and say yes, well, somebody could have come in my room and changed them all with stuff that looked exactly like the same. But he was saying, if you try and move that then into a general metaphysical statement about this is the way the whole of reality is, and this is why we can't be certain about anything, is because we can have these individual examples in nature that are skeptically vulnerable to being refuted by particular instances, are vulnerable to skepticism. He say, but you can't generalize. The only way you can generalize that skepticism into a general skepticism about the whole of the world and about the whole of nature, and that we can't be certain of anything, is by assuming the things that our skepticism has tried to refute. And that's a very, very powerful form of argument, a form of argumentation. So he's trying to say that the transcendental argument provides a justification, and in a sense it actually shows that it's one of its most powerful features is its ability to overcome skeptical doubts. And that's in the since that sort of like period at I think he published in 1959, most of the discussion in the literature about transcendental arguments, why they were, was their ability to overcome skeptical conclusions by demonstrating that only by assuming what you are trying to, your skeptical conclusion is trying to demonstrate that these things aren't what you're concluding, your skeptical conclusions, what you're assuming about reality, you're already assuming those in order to generate your skeptical argument. Plantinga called that the scandalous skepticism. You know, if you come to conclusions that say, I can't trust I can't trust what I see because I've proved that particular instances of my seeing are not accurate, and therefore none of my, you're making an inductive generalization there, aren't you? You're going from the general, from the specific to the general. And so, but you're not warranted to do that because subsequent empirical observations can correct your error. And so it's trying to show that, say, skepticism is internally inconsistent. So the transcendental mode of argument, it's one of its most powerful features, is to show that the skeptic, in order to try and generate their argument, is assuming their position of the non-skeptic to generate their skeptical conclusion, and therefore they are incoherent. They're having to assume what the non-skeptic, the assumptions of the non-skeptic, in order to generate their conclusion. So it's a very sort of powerful thought. So it's not just that, say, it's not talking about specific instances. That's the thing with transcendental arguments, is that they're not talking about specific instances. They're talking about something that's much broader, so a concept. With Strawson, he was talking about the persistence of material objects with time, and he was saying you can't get into a discussion about the persistence of objects in time without assuming something about, you're assuming what you're talking about. You've got the concept of object, you've got the concept of persistence, you've got the concept of passing of time. You can't come to a skeptical conclusion without using those concepts. You're already assuming those concepts in your argument. So that's the power of the transcendental approach, is that you're demonstrating when you're already using those things, you're trying to tell me are false. But it's not talking about, say, a specific instance in nature, because we can see there that yes, you've got this specific. It's talking about, because you can swap, have all the furniture swapped out of your room. Somebody can swap your alarm clock. Somebody can, you couldn't necessarily prove that that hadn't happened, but that doesn't invalidate your belief in the persistence of objects without you seeing them. So that's what Strawson was. That it was a principle. And other philosophers, particularly say in the Oxford School, they were saying that, say, if you use, say, a concept of, say, good or of truth, those have no. If in fact, it's better to consider it in a negative way. If you consider the concept of bad or of evil, that makes no sense to talk or being correct or being that makes no talk it makes no sense to talk about those concepts without having, say, the concept of good, correct, true. Those concepts in themselves are assuming those other concepts. If you're trying to argue for say the correctness of a view, that means that you have a concept of error. You do have a concept of correctness. So it's trying to say that it makes no sense to argue that nothing can be known without that conclusion would be considered incoherent, because you are assuming that it is possible to. You must have some sort of concept of what it means to be known if you're trying to conclude that nothing can be known. If you've never heard that before, it might be difficult to understand that. You're actually saying, so if somebody's concluding by their elaborate argument, and this has been the history of philosophy in the latter part of the 20th century, is that there was great enthusiasm for what people might call, say like a postmodern critique of modernism, but the idea of, say, if your conclusion is trying to tell you that we cannot be certain about anything, the transcendentalist would come in and say, wait a minute, you're saying we cannot be certain about anything, but in order for you to generate that conclusion, you must have the concept of certainty within your structure, within your noetic structure. You must have. It makes no sense to say I cannot be certain about anything unless you have the concept of certainty. And you're saying, if you cannot have the unless you already have that concept of certainty, you cannot generate your skeptical conclusion. And so that's the power of the transcendental critique, because you're saying, well, you're being incoherent in arguing to your skeptical conclusion, because you're assuming you're using the concept of certainty that your conclusion saying it's not possible for you to use. That's a powerful argument. So that's one of the that, I suppose, is that in brief the power of the transcendental mode of argument, is because one of its most useful and powerful elements is this sort of ability to challenge that sort of skeptical view. Got the sun just streaming in from around the corner there. And so I think that's a great point to finish on, is that sort of like that the wonderful promise in the sense of transcendental argumentation is it's the transcendental principle of sort of looking back and saying, right, what are you assuming in when you're what are you assuming in order to make sense of reality at all? And so, and it often, and somebody who's say like a skeptic is also, when you subject what their mode of argumentation, you're not arguing about a specific fact of nature, you're arguing about a principle within nature. And that's one of the things that Kant describes, that the transcendental, the prince, when you end up with a transcendental statement or some sort of transcendental deduction, what you're actually saying is that you are having to assume, even in your own argument, you are assuming that transcendental in order to construct that transcendental argument. So it's like you're already assuming that you're already assuming that it makes it possible. That's the formal way of saying it, is that it makes possible its own ground from proof. So you can never escape the transcendental principle. It's assumed in even formulating your transcendental principle, and that in a sense is almost like that sounds really complicated when you put it that way, but it's a bit like saying, when you're writing a letter to somebody, you're always assuming within that you're going to have to assume certain laws of grammar, principles of grammar, and so you can't escape that. And so when you're formulating, say, like an argument, you can never escape certain basic things, certain transcendentals, which allow you to do that in the first place. And so this is one of the things that, as I progress through my work, I'm trying to say that those presuppositions of knowledge, those presuppositions, those things that you assume as presuppositions, that's when transcendentalism is so helpful to you, is because you're analysing and you're demonstrating to somebody that even though they might be, and in the particular, when it gets to the end of my work, what I'm actually trying, when I try and say, once I've sort of like climbed up this big philosophical ladder, and I'm saying, right, how does this affect, say, our relationship to God, or our concept of God? How are we doing? How does God fit into this process? Why? And so, and the God, in a sense, becomes the transcendental that guarantees all the other transcendentals of nature, because it's always been a problem, particularly in the latter half of the 20th century, when people have become very materialist, very naturalistic, want to reject sort of God, want to evict God from all sorts of domains of knowledge, and you as a transcendentalist, you push at that point and saying, how can you say within your worldview that there is logic, that there is structure, that there is meaning, that there is, because you look at, say, something like deconstructionism, or the consequences of, if you say yes, the postmodern view was very much, there is nothing, it's all socially defined, it's all arbitrary, it's all relativistic, there is no certainty, there is no truth, and you end up with philosophy collapsing into anti-philosophy. In a sense, it's actually saying, well, our final conclusion is that there is no rhyme, there is no reason, there is no grounding for logic. It's all arbitrary. It's just something that might be useful to us. It's all instruments. But you get people that push and push and push and push, and eventually the result of your philosophy is that you're actually saying, well, there can't be any philosophy. There is nothing that gives us coherence. There's just a random multiverse of unrelated contingent things happening. And so the idea of transcendentalism, in the sense, when you say, well, you're trying to say, well, actually, no, they're not random. The reason why we have really the reason why we can talk about laws of nature, or the reason why we can have discussions about causality, of the reason that we can unravel the riddle of induction, the reason why we provide a grounding for sort of why we can consider, why we can generate the conditions that allow a legitimate, say, pragmatic approach, what we can justify, say, the principles that a pragmatist might use, or we can actually answer the question, well, what is better, what is good, what is beneficial for society. We provide transcendentals which legitimately give us a basis for using, say, right, say these are what is beneficial, this would be good. We believe that because we have some sort of transcendental basis for they're not just arbitrary. We would never advocate, say, building, tower blocks on a pragmatic basis, because there is nowhere in, say, in the Christian worldview where, say, scripture or the history of would suggest that is a way, that is the best way for people to live. And that's what we're sort of saying. We're saying that our transcendental justification for establishing those principles comes from the transcendental of the Christian understanding of God. So the Trinity becomes the transcendental that ultimately resolves, say, the problem of universals and particulars. That is one of the I think we studied in the last talk. I was talking about Frege and how he had the concept of non natural entities of number. So there were like things that existed. They were non-physical. Sorry, that's a better way of saying it, is that they were non-physical, but they were real. So the concepts existed and that was one of the most forceful and radical and revolutionary attempts to try and resolve this problem of particular and universal, of actually saying the universal was actually a real entity that existed, but it wasn't natural, it wasn't part of the natural world. And so the physical world, I keep getting those two terms are distinct. It's better to say the physical world. So they were non-real, non-physical, but they were real. And so non-natural, it's difficult to use these words without importing in a lot of philosophical balance there. But that idea of the universal as existing, but being non-physical. So part of, if you like, part of what was real, but not part of what we would call nature. And but the problem was that his view, he then said, well, that view then led in the analytic movement led into the logical positive view of, and so his resolution of that problem of the universe and the particular which governed the language was a reflection of the objects of reality, and we are directly in contact with those objects through our language. But that led to the rigorous and the constraints of the logical positivism, which, when you look at it, that was too tight, that was too rigid, and that ignores the vast swathe of human experience. And so that resolution of the problem of universal in particular fails at that point. Whereas with the Christian concept of the Trinity, of there being a unity, so three persons but one God, that's a perfect resolution of that problem. And so the idea of the concept of universality and the concept of particularity are resolved in this ultimate. It provides the ultimate transcendental, which allows you to generate a coherent philosophy from coherent first principles, because that's something else that happened within particularly in modern philosophies, that people began to say that let's get away from this idea of first philosophy, of there needing a foundation, some sort of foundation for knowledge. This idea of there being a first philosophy, only particulars exist. That was the whole empiricist emphasis, is that only particulars exist. And so that's just been a message that's flipped across the bottom of my screen from my wife. She's away in Japan at the moment, so I got distracted. Apologies there. And so the resolution of that universe and that particular allows you to generate, say, a coherent philosophy, and you haven't got all those unanswered questions. Whereas the 20th century, late 20th century approach to that problem was to say, well, there is no way we can resolve this problem. All we've got is this big mass of multiverse of ideas. It's even come into the common parlance now. People talk about multiverse. It's appearing in a lot of films and stuff, isn't it? People are talking about the multiverse. Whereas the concept of a universe was there was a fundamental unity between all the different branches of human knowledge. That there's a unifying principle. That's why universities were called universities, because it was trying to show that all these different aspects, all these different disciplines of human knowledge are fundamentally related at some point. And so for the Christian believer, for the ultimate aim of the Christian transcendentalist is to say there is this fundamental unifying principle that allows you to say that yes, there is a natural law. Why is there a natural law? Because the Lord has committed in His Word that there's certain principles within nature. And He said as long as day and night, summer and winter, heat and cold remain, then the world will remain. He commits, and He commits to this. He commits that the world will behave. In that provides you with a justification for induction, because there's no logical. Induction is always logically fallible, but the only way you can justify induction is that the regularity that we actually see in nature is not just something. It's not something that we just observe and we've ended up, but it's something that's guaranteed by the commitment that the Lord makes to the world. So the great sort of like the great promise of the transcendental way of looking at is by generating these principles that allow you to then rediscover this concept of the universe, of there being a rhyme and there being a reason, that things that aren't completely absurd, aren't completely socially defined. It provides a reason and a rationale. And so if I just reiterate, we started off talking about sort of proof, different concepts of proof, rational, empirical, if you like, leads you into inductive proofs, pragmatic proofs, and then transcendental proofs. The key aspect of a transcendental proof is that a transcendental proof isn't trying to prove, say, like an individual fact that you might be trying to argue about when you've got, say, like a particular instance, say, like with an inductive argument, or with a particular instance, if you were doing some sort of pragmatic approach to a particular problem, you're trying to give yourself a specific answer to a specific question. The best way to understand a transcendental argument is to actually trying to say what are you assuming in order to generate to pose anything to what is it in the concept question that how do you legitimize even the concept of being able to ask a question? Because it's almost like when you're asking a question, you're assuming there is an answer, if you're assuming there is an answer, that means that you're assuming something about the metaphysical character of reality. That's the ultimate challenge, and that's the ultimate challenge for a this is why when Cornelius Van Til was talking about the sun is nearly around the corner, so I'm coming in and out of the sun here, which means that probably the videos are dark and then light. That was the ultimate thing for sort of like for Cornelius Van Til when he was discussing this sort of like problem. He was saying it's not so much what theory of reality are you having to assume in order to generate even a concept of proof. So the transcendental question about proofs is not you can have a deductive proof or you can have an inductive proof or you can have a pragmatic proof or you can. It's rather the question. The transcendental question is, what do you mean? What theory of reality do you have to assume in order to even have the concept of proof? What are you assuming about reality when you are when you're even wanting to say that you can even have a proof? And that is why transcendental questions are so important, because they are dealing with your fundamental assumptions about reality. It's like your presuppositions about reality. What are the presuppositions of your worldview? There was a very famous philosopher of science in the 1960s, and his book is still considered one of the milestones in the philosophy of science. He was somebody called Kuhn, and it's called I think it's called Scientific Revolutions. Is it Scientific Revolutions? But he had this concept of paradigms, and he was saying you have a governing paradigm in different aspects in different eras of science, and instead of science being like a linear process of just building up on what people have previously done, what suddenly happens is that there's a dramatic change, like the change from, say, Newtonian physics to Einsteinian physics. They're not reconcilable in any fundamental way. They're totally different. Their basic presuppositions are different. And so this idea of presuppositions, and in the work of Quine also, the idea that Quine was saying, well, you have a general theory of the world that you bring to the problem, and it's you can't discuss or move outside or generate any kind of argument unless you are presupposing a particular view of the world. He was very relativistic in a way in which he said you can take the pick of any empirically sufficient theory. You don't. He's not. But he was saying that. So because of the under attestation of his formal way of saying it was the under attestation of a theory, you can never come to a comprehensive theory about the world that would be able to supply you all the answers about the world unless you had already had all the data about the world, which is famous holism. But he was saying that to the degree of usefulness of a theory, if your theory is gives you a reasonable empirical prediction about what you're trying to solve, then it's valid. So he was saying your theory of nature, as long as it's empirically sufficient for whatever the problem was, it's perfectly okay to have that theory or somebody else to have another theory if it's empirically sufficient for them. So, and that obviously is very relativistic, and it was the same with Kuhn. Really, he was actually saying, well, you can have all these different paradigms that might be okay for a particular time, but then suddenly it becomes inadequate, and a new science comes out, and so you end up with all these sort of particularly views of a view of knowledge that is very fluid, and very non-normative. You know, there's no, you can never be certain about anything. You're always understanding, oh, there's always this degree of fallibility and uncertainty. And you then have the problem as to say, well, why is your way, those are your fundamental paradigms, your fundamental presuppositions of life. So that was where this term paradigm really came into, say, modern philosophy and a modern philosophy of science, a philosophy of language. It was a very influential concept when you're governing paradigm. The challenge then really becomes, well, how do all these competing paradigms of understanding and of life and of worldviews, conceptual schemes, how do all these competitors, how do you decide between the truth of these and, or can any of them ever be true? Are they just adequate, like Quine says? Well, these are just, you can have a view of nature and it can be any of many. Whereas what a transcendentalist, particularly, you know, and as I work through my work, what I'm actually trying to demonstrate is that when you look at worldviews, when you take the transcendental argument to, well, what you're assuming, the point I was trying to get to about 50 minutes ago, I think, was that Cornelius Van Til would say that a summary of the transcendental argument with regards to God would be to say atheism assumes theism. You know, he used to just sort of point at one of his students and say, unpack that for me. And so the basic assumption, what you're trying to actually say here is that in order to use logic, in order to generate an argument, in order to be rational, in order to come to any sort of conclusion that an atheist would want to generate about God, is that the very structures of the thought that allows you to come up with an atheistic argument is only possible because you've assumed what theism, the principles of theism. You're using the transcendentals, which are generated by a theistic view, in order to generate your atheistic argument, and that is a very, very, very powerful view, powerful argument, because it's very hard to refute that particular argument. Because if you think one of the most famous atheists of the or who thought through whether or not they were a thoroughgoing atheist at the end of their life is of interest. But one of the most famous philosophers was Jean-Paul Sartre, and he is famous in also he started off in Sorbonne. He taught philosophy, and then he left academic philosophy, but he became one of the most famous philosophers of that period, in particular of the mid I think maybe early 30s he started merging, but he was very famous during the 1960s, and he conducted the war trials after the Second World War with Russell, Bertrand Russell. They didn't have any legal standing, but there were war crime trials against the atrocities of the United States. During the. But he, in his autobiography, which is just called Words, he was very famous because he was an amazing literary figure. He could write amazing plays, but he, in his writing, he eventually gets to the point where he realizes that if you follow through the presuppositions of atheism, Nietzsche had this insight as well. If you follow through the presuppositions of atheism, you end up destroying your own philosophy. It's like he wrote something very, very poignant. He sort of like said, he said, I found I found the Holy Ghost in the cellar, and I had to throw him out. And he said, because he said that if he wrote, what he meant by that was that if he was writing something, and the aim of that writing was to convince other people, that meant he assumed that there was some rational structure of the world, there was some logical structure to the world, it was possible to reach people, there was some sort of structure outside of himself that he was assuming. And so he was, because he eventually got to the point where he was saying that, he said, I used to think my pen was a sword, but now I realise how helpless we are. So he was actually saying that his whole entire profession, what had motivated him for his entire life, why he wrote, what motivated him to write, was he actually realised that what was actually motivated him to write, what was behind, what his presuppositions for even wanting to write were based on this something that was in his cellar of his life, which was this post-Christian assumption. He was operating on Christian assumptions when he was writing what he was trying to write, when he was trying to, he said that he remained a Marxist throughout his whole life. But I think he left the Communist Party. I think he wasn't a member of the Communist Party for very long after the Second World War, I think. But he said that he was still a Marxist, but he was an existentialist. I mean, that was his that was what he was famous for. He wasn't famous as, say, like an expositor of Marxism. He was famous as an existentialist. But he realised, as Nietzsche did, because Nietzsche's one of his famous is the madman rushing into the square, saying, I've killed God, because he said, I think he writes somewhere, I hear that we don't, what I'm trying to remember, I hear that we don't believe in God, but, or that I believe I'll have to paraphrase it, can't remember the exact phrase, but it says, I hear we don't believe in God, but we still believe in grammar. And what he was trying to say there was that the idea of order, of relation, Noam Chomsky picks this up in his depth grammar. He was saying there seems to be this underlying structure in language, which seems to be, and what's more is it seems to be common to all languages. And so that whole idea of Nietzsche sort of like realised that even believing in grammar, the concept of grammar is assuming an order, and it's assuming an origin, and a, if you like, a transcendental, which is coming, an organising principle, which had been provided, which had been put into philosophy because of the theistic assumption, and particularly in his thought, it had come into the West because of as a post-Christian thing. The assumption was a Christian assumption of there being order, structure, laws of nature. Those things that had existed. In a sense, we often go back to sort of like to ancient Greece and the Renaissance, and people that had made empirical observations about the world. But what was in the sense was unique about the Christian view is that it provided a coherence it gave a justification for the laws of nature from the books of Genesis all the way through. It's like a internally coherent view that has generated. It caused a radical change when the Reformation came to the world, and that way of thinking affected not just sort of Christian cultures or there, but it went into the Islamic world and into nations that, even though they have a different religion, they've nevertheless been influenced by Western pattern of thought, which were based in the Reformation understanding that provided, because of the transcendentals of the Christian transcendentals of the Trinity, that gave us laws of nature, predictability, causality, all these different aspects that provide us with a strong logical and the ability to generate objectivity rather than just collapsing into subjectivity. That's the power of the transcendental approach, in the sense that you're being able to recover some sort of objectivity, which the history of 20th century philosophy should show us, is that the great phenomenological movement, which that tried to recover some sort of objectivity, but it then degenerated into existentialism, which says no, we can't have any objectivity. It's always subjectivity, and the role of in the sense of the subject and the person in the second half of the 20th century in philosophy and particularly in the postmodern view, where everything is subjective and it's all filtered through us. There's not even the possibility of that there could be the objective. The great promise of the transcendental approach of the Christian structure is that it gives you the reason why we have to look back and say, why did the Reformation have such an enormous impact on the world? Is because it made possible, it gave like a justification for determinism, it gave a justification for the laws of nature. People weren't, there were no longer sort of like the teleological explanations that derived from Aristotelism and scholasticism. Natural science relied on this sort of principle of induction. And one of the great achievements of the Reformation was to have a rule of the world that was predictable. There were certain principles that God had put into the world. There was a concept of God as somebody that followed his own rules, that followed his own laws, that it wasn't as if God could just decide and was committed. There was like a covenant. There was a covenant commitment, a very strong commitment. He said, "I've made this covenant with the day and the night, and with the heavens and the earth." That there was like a covenant. God was committing himself to there being a particular way of the world working, and that was what was so powerful in the Reformation view, is that it allowed different spheres of life, the artistic, the political, the scientific, the philosophical, the theological. All of these had spheres of influence and importance, and laws that operated within them, and they were seen in that way. And so you can see that the transcendental of the Trinity, it allows and gives basis for those principles, that they're not just arbitrary or socially constructed or inductive generalizations. They are something much stronger. They're based in the character of God. So I hope that it's just a little bit of an introduction to proof and the transcendental argument, and I'm sure we will, and the promise and the power of the transcendental approach, because the transcendental approach is really trying to dig down to the big, deep philosophical questions of how can you justify what your knowledge is. The second half of the 20th century, in many ways, the epistemology collapsed. The big questions of philosophy, people said, you can't answer them, we don't need to answer them, we can get on with our little micro analysis and we don't need to understand the world. In fact, the world's not even understandable. And in a sense, the whole process of philosophy, the whole discipline of philosophy is just It's just, it's been abandoned. And so in a sense, the great promise, and what I'm trying to do in my own work, was to say that if we understand the assumptions of what we are even assuming when we're behaving as scientists, when we investigate what our perceived presuppositions are, what those transcendental principles, presuppositions, transcendentals, close synonyms, we would, what are our presuppositions of life. When we identify our presuppositions of life, then that should bring us back and actually say, it's almost like a call. Yes, there is God. It's not as if it's like just a convenient starting point, but it's a transcendental. It's not arguing that God has to be necessary for, say, in a particular case. It's actually saying that it gives an overall coherence and possibility for scientific laws in the first place. It's God, in declaring his commitment and making his covenant, has made science possible. So that's one of the key distinctive of Christian transcendental philosophy, is that this evidential tussle that happens in evidentialism when Christians are arguing with, say, non-Christians about, say, evidence for the resurrection, or evidence that the bones of Jesus here, or arguing about particular instances which can be, if additional evidence comes to mind, if you founded, say, your argument on some archaeological fact, and then another archaeologist 20 years later or a century later then says, well, actually that was incomplete, this is a better understanding of it, you then have, it can then invalidate everything that's been built on that, and you have to rebuild or re-evaluate, or then go and do some extra research. Whereas the transcendental approach is just saying that the very concept of evidence, and you actually being able to say with some sort of determinism, even to get the transcendental question, is actually saying what is evidence? Why is evidence possible in the first place? And so you can see how important a transcendental analysis is because you're actually asking those questions, right? What is, what do we mean by science? What do we mean by evidence? What do we mean by, we're not just saying, oh well, one something in the philosophy of science which was quite popular for a time was the pragmatic, particularly the pragmatic approach. It was, well, whatever we do when we call ourselves scientists, whatever scientists do, and whatever method it is that we're presenting in science, that's the model for rationality. And in some ways that's very, very close to logical positivism, which was why the positivists and the pragmatists were in some ways competing for the if you like, the soul of 20th century science during the sort of like the 30s and the 40s. That was the time where there was the most activity within sort of the American pragmatism and with the logical positivist movement, which was ended up being centered in the US. And they're very similar in that sense, is that your basic way of doing things, and of actually saying, well, we can't dig beyond a certain level. We're just assuming certain things are true. We're not asking the big questions. We just want to solve problems. So we had the different manifestos. So, but the great thing about sort of like transcendentalism is that you are moving beyond that. You are actually saying, right, why are these things working? Why does science work? What are we assuming that says why would scientific analysis be useful? Why is it working in the same place? What are we assuming? and so my whole work, in a sense, is to put meat on those questions, rather than, and to try and, because they're bold statements, aren't they? To say, well, God's the transcendental that sort of guarantees all other transcendentals, because you could be, like in the sense like Kant was, he came up with a psychological analysis which was to provide the transcendental basis for our understanding, which was based on reason alone. It wasn't making reference to his psychological apparatus. Didn't make any reference. Didn't import in any theological principles. Didn't assume any theological principles. He wanted, the title of his work on moral philosophy was religion within the bounds of reason alone. So his transcendental, the justification for, he was trying to generate a set of transcendentals that would justify all human knowledge on this psychological basis alone. But we would want to argue and say, well, even if you consider that he was successful, and most, despite his enormous reputation, many would say, no, he wasn't successful, he failed, which is why we had the whole series of responses to Kant in the 19th century, and then in a sense, the renunciation of Kant in the positivist movement, and then we've had naturalism in the second part of the 20th century, and then we've had sort of like almost like a despair and people would, a subjectivization of philosophy in the period, perhaps what you would call the postmodern period. And I think we're in a sense, we're beyond postmodernism now, because postmodern, in some respects, there's still some things in our culture which are very much postmodern in their, concepts of gender, for example, and gender being fluid, and they very much have a postmodern base. They're from postmodern thought, but there's been an attempt to move beyond pure subjectivity in our relations, but you always then struggle. What basis have you got for asserting any type of person independence? And that's why transcendentalism, and Christian transcendentalism in particular, it's why it's so important that you provide some sort of foundation for knowledge, which is why I call my work epistemological self-consciousness. So I hope this has been some sort of I think it's got some of the most interesting things, where you've got sort of like the concept of proof, you've got sort of the problems of induction and abduction and rational logic, all these sort of things that are so central to our worldviews. And then we're going to say, well, how do you ground those at all? And that's what you call, if you like, the transcendental question. That's when you're talking about transcendental proofs. And when you talk about transcendental proofs and grounding what you believe, you can either take, say, the atheist route of saying, well, we have no grounding, or some sort of agnostic route where you're saying we've no idea where we ground. How do we're agnosis, which is actually the interesting thing about the word agnostic. Was that I think it was coined by Huxley, I think, one of the Huxleys. It might have been Aldous Huxley, and it wasn't an honorary, because we often think now, somebody who says they're agnostic, we often think they're a little bit more sophisticated. They're sort of like it's like, if you're at a party and you were saying, well, actually I'm agnostic, you're sort of like trying to say, I don't believe the evidence shows us one way or another that we can be certain of a belief in. So you're not, you're prepared in a sense. You're almost like saying, you're saying, well, I can't believe it, but I can't. The evidence doesn't convince me one way or another. And it was originally, it's sort of it's got like almost like a positive connotation, isn't it? It's got somebody who's open-minded. Whereas like when Huxley coined the term, the Latin equivalent to it is actually ignoramus. So, because agnosis is just like Greek, it's the alpha primitive with gnosis, agnostic, just comes in there. And so, whereas the Latin is actually ignoramus, so it wasn't an honorary title at all. He didn't consider it an honorary title at all. He said it's one without knowledge, i.e. an ignoramus. So, it's the whole promise of transcendental argument is to move us beyond sort of ignorance of our worldview and the cynicism of modern philosophy, where you say, no, there is no rhyme, there is no reason, there is no universe, there's just multiverse, and there's just, there is no determinism, there's just contingency, there is no laws of nature, they're just inductive generalizations. Science is, if science is successful, if it's useful for us, then which we said was begging the question, well, how do you decide what's useful, what's good? And you get to that the very sad state of, say, of a Sartre, where he realizes, he says that atheism is a cruel, I think that's the term he used, atheism is a cruel master. Because he suddenly realised that his whole motivation for his life in his writing and his plays and his teaching and his philosophy, he suddenly realised that he said the Holy Ghost was down in the basement. He realised that the whole motivation for his life was based on post-Christian principles of his culture, and he's saying that when you jettison those, like postmodernists like Derrida realised that and said, right, we have to jettison those too. What do we end up with? And in fact, you don't end up with anything. And that was the great, the deconstructionist movement and the, if you like, the anarchism, the intellectual anarchism that came into that movement of denying that there was any meaning in texts and denying there was anything normative. And the ethical implications of that, the chaos in some aspects. Gender studies is a great example of the chaos that results from denying that there's any sort of normative basis for gender, or any biological basis for gender. And so the whole the implications of this view, that I think that's the great thing, the consequences and implications of abandoning any sort of transcendental conception of philosophy, we see all too easily. Okay, so will I leave that there? Yes, I think what I'm probably going to pick up on, I will do a more formal study of Transcendentalism, but this was meant to be almost like be a precursor to me talking about I was originally only going to talk about proof today, and then I've gone off like I normally do and sort of got into the meat a bit more. But I will do another one where we're just talking about, try and be a little bit more formal about a transcendental argument and actually say, the logical form of it, assume X, X implicitly assumes Y is what we're arguing about. But the skeptic accepts X, they might not accept Y, but if they accept X, the transcendental argument is demonstrating that they're assuming Y by accepting X. So that's the promise of the power of the transcendental argument, is that you're demonstrating to the skeptic that they can't get the skeptical argument off the ground without assuming what they're contradicting. So thank you very much. God bless you, and I'll see you next time.